Okay. Welcome if you're here for the first time, or welcome back again to our 2025 Winter Learning Series. My name is Dana Ripper. I'm with the Missouri River Bird Observatory, and here also from MRBO is Ethan Duke. Our mission is conservation via science, education, and advocacy. You can find out all about us on mrbo.org, of course. I would like to thank the Conservation Federation of Missouri's David Risberg Memorial Grant Program and our MRBO supporters. Thank you all for making this winter learning series possible. So, folks that have been with us before, you know that we're hosting these in the hopes that they help you become more informed about a variety of topics and inspired to take action on behalf of our native ecosystems and the wildlife and people with which we share those ecosystems. So topics that I think, based on lots of questions that we've gotten here at MRBO, are on people's minds. So before we begin tonight, I want to make a comment about current events. We've been getting lots of questions, of course, about what's going on lately at the federal level with environmental policy and funding. And with so many news sources out there and a variety of spins on information, I don't know exactly what people are hearing. What we get here at MRBO are things like memos and summary documents from partner organizations compiled by experienced environmental lawyers and policy analysts, folks like our speaker this evening. We're also getting information directly from colleagues at other NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and state and federal agencies. And folks, it's bad. I'm not going to dissemble. Program funding and personnel have indeed been cut across various agencies that affect all of our collective environmental work. And the cuts are just, they're reckless and without any kind of real analysis of the program or the position's purpose or merit or effectiveness. This is happening, and this is just, the agencies that were very closely involved with: EPA, Fish and Wildlife Service, USDA, USGS, also U.S. Forest Service, BLM, in Missouri and across the country. So these things are affecting not only federal staff and operations, but are already having a variety of really negative consequences at state agencies and nonprofit organizations. So this is just the conservation sector that I personally move in. We've also heard alarming news about the medical and public health sectors, of course, and even veteran services. So the question that we get all the time, and Shiv, you probably get this question all the time too, is like, what can we as individuals do? And I'm sure we'll talk about this more this evening, but I'm gonna say the thing that nobody likes to hear and even less people like to do, which is please, please call your US senators and representatives. Please do that. Please call them. I know it feels like they don't listen, but if they don't hear from us, they're not going to know what we're saying. They can't hear me talking right now. They don't hear us talking to each other. They don't see the things that we, send to our friends out of outrage. Um, and from what I have heard, I absolutely guarantee that they do hear from people that want to see environmental programs cut and things like equity and diversity programs cut and clean energy investment to be undermined. They hear about that. So how much do they really hear from regular constituents that we do want these programs? And it is my understanding that calls are logged and that sometimes it doesn't take all that very many to really get attention. So I'm almost done with my public service announcement of the day. It is also my understanding from people with policy and law expertise that much of what is happening is in direct violation of the United States Constitution. So we need to demand that our senators and representatives stop their absconding from their duties and take back the constitutionally mandated authority of Congress to provide checks and balances to the executive branch. So thank you for listening. It is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker, Shiv Srivastava. He is the policy director at Fenceline Watch, a community-based environmental justice organization based in Houston, Texas. He has a background in political strategy and opposition research. Shiv was a fellow in the Mickey Leland Program at the Hobby School for Public Affairs under the Obama administration and served as an intern for Texas Representative Lloyd Doggett in Washington, D.C. Shiv published a thesis that examined South Asian voter participation and the impacts it would portend for the region and political future for the state of Texas. Prior to joining Fenceline Watch, Shiv was a freelance writer working in the television and digital spaces. As part of Fenceline Watch, he has contributed to efforts related to language justice under Title VI, fought against greenwashing and false solutions, and is actively engaged in the United Nations negotiations for a global plastic treaty. So, Shiv, thank you for being here, and please proceed, sir.
Thank you so much, Dana and Ethan. I'd like to start off by thanking you both, as well as the Missouri River Bird Observatory, for having me, and for everyone joining this evening. As Dana, as you were just mentioning, it is a difficult and scary time, and this isn't any less difficult or scary, but I hope that this presentation and some of the stuff that we discuss will also give hope that there is a better way, and that we don't have to lay down and just take whatever is being sent our way. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start this presentation. Okay, so here we go. All right.
All good.
So awesome. So today we're going to be talking about plastics, petrochemicals, and communities on the front line, what the true cost of plastic is. So just a little bit about who we are. As Dana mentioned, my name is Shiv Srivastava. I'm the policy director at Fenceline Watch. We're an environmental justice community-based group here on the east end of Houston, Texas. We're dedicated to fighting multi-generational toxic harm that is faced by fenceline and frontline communities that are right at the border of oil, gas, and petrochemical industry. Our work is centered around three pillars: protecting the democratic process through public participation around things such as language justice, the link between petrochemicals to plastic, and crisis response, such as chemical disaster response that we deal with a lot here on the Gulf Coast. So just a little lay of the land, a little table setting. Environmental justice, what does that mean? Environmental justice is environmental racism. It's the kind of institutional racism that we see in many spaces in society and around the world, around policies and practices and procedures of institutions that disproportionately negatively impact racial minorities' access to goods, services, opportunities, such as housing, poor safety and environmental standards, poor schooling, disproportionately long prison sentences, and over-policing. Systemic racism, as it ties to the environment, has a very strong and proven correlation. We see that oil, gas, petrochemical infrastructure, pipelines often are found in poor, rural, and oftentimes communities of color, and they follow the same lines as historic redlining and other discriminatory practices. So that's just a little bit about environmental justice and kind of what orients us at Fenceline Watch with the work that we do. So why are we here? We're going to be talking about petrochemicals and plastic, but oftentimes when we think about plastic and the problems with plastic, we think about them in a certain light. So microplastics, I'm sure almost all of us on the call have heard some of the very disturbing findings that have been coming out over the past 5-10 years about microplastics being found on our shores, in our bodies, in the placenta of pregnant people, even in the rain clouds and in our blood. But I think another part of this that's often not fully understood by the general public and by many in a lot of spaces is that 98% of plastic is derived from fossil fuels. And so what you see on screen right here is kind of the full life cycle of plastic. It's not the water bottle that is discarded and then ends up in the ocean. The actual life cycle begins at extraction of fossil fuels from fracked gas, oil and gas. Then it goes over to the chemical feedstock production process, the petrochemicals that we're going to be speaking about today. Then it finds its way into products that all of us are familiar with, whether it's fast fashion or the unnecessary but very quickly delivered Amazon order that so many use day to day and order. Then to waste management, things such as recycling or lack of recycling, and finally, ocean dumping that disproportionately impacts vulnerable communities, especially in the global south. So this is why we're plastic production is set to triple by 2060, at approximately 2.5 to 5% per year growth. CL, the Center for International Environmental Law, actually predicts that about 40 billion tons of plastic will be produced by 2060, with about 6 billion tons already present on Earth today. That's a problem. As we know, plastic doesn't really degrade and it leaches. But the other side of that, the upstream side of that, is what's in that plastic, what's in that water bottle, what's in your shampoo bottle, what's in the plastic that holds your medication. There are about 16,000 chemicals that are potentially used or present in plastic materials and products. Only 6% of those chemicals are currently subject to any international regulation. What that means in more basic terms is that there is a cocktail of thousands of chemicals that go into plastic and plastic production that we don't know a lot about, unfortunately. We don't know what the human health impacts are, short-term or even in a more longitudinal view. And there's a lack of transparency or information domestically here in the United States, and unfortunately globally, as to how we can get that information and what's being done to actually glean what are the impacts of the chemicals that are being used in this plastic. Finally, all of these things, petrochemical production, overproduction of plastic, it increases the triple planetary crisis that we are facing. And it makes actually staying below the 1.5 Celsius global target nearly impossible. We cannot actually adhere to our necessary climate goals and the goals that we need to meet in order to have protective standards for our environment, as long as we are still producing petrochemicals and an overabundance of plastic. So just a little bit about my community. So I am based in Houston, Texas. Fenceline Watch is in Houston, Texas. That's along the Gulf Coast. We have about 7.1 million people in the greater Houston area. The Houston Ship Channel, which is on the east end, where I'm currently speaking to you from, is actually the largest petrochemical complex in the United States. It's the second largest in the world. It's 52 miles. We have about 687 chemical manufacturing establishments. Out of the 4 largest and oldest oil refineries, we are home to 2 of them. We have 343 facilities that are regulated by the Toxic Substance Control Act, TSCA, and we have 378 facilities that are required to report to EPA's toxic release inventory, because the chemicals that are on site are regulated as being incredibly harmful to human health and safety. And if you notice on this, there are the names of 2 communities, 3 actually: Magnolia Park, Manchester, and Smith Addition. So Fenceline Watch, we work with these civic associations that are actually dotted along the Houston Ship Channel. You can see their populations there. An interesting thing about Houston, unlike any other major American city, is that we have absolutely no zoning laws. So our organization's name is Fenceline Watch because in Houston, you literally can have a home sharing a fence with a major petrochemical or oil and gas refinery or piece of infrastructure. And we see what those impacts are in our community's health. Magnolia Park, which I am currently speaking to you from, It ranks in the 98th percentile in the entire nation for toxic releases to air. Manchester, which is just up the street, about 4.5 minutes up, ranks in the 97th percentile for US air toxic cancer risk. So all of those facilities translate into what we as a city and as a Gulf Coast produce. The Houston metropolitan area produces about 42% of the total US base petrochemical capacity, with those 687 plants, 230 plastic and rubber plants, and 93 petroleum products plants. And as you can see, we produce about 60% of butadiene, 39% of ethylene, xylene, toluene. As you can see, we produce a lot of petrochemicals, and all of these specific chemicals actually go directly into the production of plastics in the form of feedstocks and precursors. And so what we have here is 50 of the petrochemical companies in the world. A fourth of them are headquartered here in the US. Before the administration changed, late last year, we were able to take the delegation that's representing the United States in the United Nations negotiations around a global plastics treaty. And we took them to the facilities that you see highlighted in yellow. These are the ones that are situated in our community, and they're primary producers of polymers and petrochemicals for plastic feedstocks. I implore you guys, if you're watching this on a tablet or a computer and you have your phone handy, there's a QR code. And if you scan that QR code, you will be taken to this map that you see on the screen. It's an interactive map where we have actually created a little tour that you can take through Google Maps and see what each one of these facilities does, who owns them, some of the health impacts, but also you'll notice on the map, and you can see it on the screen here, the proximity to homes and churches and schools and parks. So it's completely understood that when we're discussing these facilities, we're not talking about industrial areas. In fact, we're talking about communities. And these are the communities that are hurt first and worst in this, but they're far from the only folks that are getting impacted, as we all are. I really hope you guys scan that. And if you want, you can go along in the map as we kind of discuss a little bit more to get a better idea. So with all of this, what are the impacts to our community and communities along the Gulf Coast, not just in Texas, but also in Louisiana? We see in Cancer Alley and even in the Ohio River Valley, where they're starting to terraform that entire area to look more like my community, what this petrochemical production for plastic looks like and what it does to these communities. So on the left, you'll see actually what we have here in Texas. We have an environmental agency known as the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ. And they put out reports anytime that there is a fire or an explosion or a leak. And I always say that it's not really a question of if there's going to be a fire or if there's going to be an explosion or if there's going to be a leak, but simply when. This happens multiple times a year. Severe releases. Sometimes they're invisible. Oftentimes you'll see giant flares, as you can see in the photo over there. There was a festival going on and there's a giant flare. We had an explosion just at the end of last year. We've already had several leaks this year. And it's important to keep in mind that here in Texas, all of this is self-reported. There's no third-party auditor that's making sure that the numbers that are being provided by industry for the public to look at are actually accurate. So our ability to know what is going on and if the amounts of emissions of cancer-causing chemicals such as benzene are actually accurate are very difficult. We have air monitoring systems, but oftentimes being able to get to that information, fully understand that information and parse it becomes very difficult for normal community members that are just trying to live their lives. So here are a couple of examples. March 2019, we had the Intercontinental Terminal Company fire, the ITC fire. It burned for several days. This huge black plume of smoke just darted across the sky for about 6 days, 42 miles long. It was behind the giant skyscrapers in downtown Houston. In 2023, we had the Shell Deer Park Chemicals plant. They create polymers and plastic feedstocks. And actually, Yvette, our executive director, and myself, anytime that there's a fire or an explosion, we get out into the car and we go document it, because oftentimes during chemical disasters, information about what's going on is very hard to come by. When you're dealing with infrastructure as dense as it is along the Gulf Coast, and especially in the Houston Ship Channel, you will have multiple facilities stacked next to each other. So this May 2023 Shell Deer Park chemical explosion is right next to the Pemex oil refinery. And so whenever there's an explosion or a fire, trying to suss out, is it the refinery that's on fire? Is it the chemical facility that's on fire, is very difficult. This happened to happen the day before summer release for schools. And as you can see, a school bus was going by. This happened at about 2:30 in the afternoon, just as school was letting out. And we saw multiple school buses going as that flare and the explosion continued, which we later found out was containing actually toluene and benzene. More recently, in August 2024, the TPC group, the Texas Petrochemical group, had a massive fire in which no information was given to the public, and we had to rely on, at the time, publicly available databases to try to glean information. Finally, at the bottom, you'll see that's a compliance history put together by EPA for ExxonMobil's Olefin Baytown plant. So they produce olefins, which goes to the manufacture of plastic feedstocks. If you notice the little red blocks, there's several of them. CAA stands for Clean Air Act. This Exxon Olefins plant has been a major violator of the Clean Air Act for about 4 years straight. It's been a major violator of many of these environmental standards. And unfortunately, despite being in violation of federal standards and laws, there's very little actual repercussion for their bad behavior. We see that play out time and time again, where if we were to break the law as just general citizens and folks, we would have consequences. But unfortunately, if you're Exxon or if you're any other of these violators, we often see that that's not the case. And the people that are forced to bear the burden of this is vulnerable, low resource communities such as our own. So there are about 866 instances of health impacts that were recorded across 16 associated health effects in our community. These ranged from cancer to ocular and renal problems, respiratory, neurological effects. Many children in our communities suffer from delayed development, and also endocrine disruption. A lot of these chemicals impact the endocrine system, which is incredibly important and vital in the development of many important organs and systems in our body, and they are impacted for generations. And so when I began, I said that Fenceline Watch is dedicated to battling the multi-generational toxic harm that our communities face. And this is what I mean by multi-generational toxic harm. Many of these petrochemicals that are produced for plastic impact our bodies in ways that's akin to a pebble that's being thrown into the middle of a lake. The initial hit of the rock is just the first part. It ripples and it ripples and it ripples. Some of these chemicals actually change our genetics, our DNA, disrupt our endocrine system. So even if you only have slight health effects yourself, your children have a higher propensity for things like cancer, or they're born with a higher propensity for heart disease. And when they have children, that continues on to the point where even if you're able to move out of one of these neighborhoods that's right at the fence line of facilities and industry, the fence line is now within you. And so it's not just a matter of, I live in a neighborhood that's impacted by this. It literally is a determinant for generations of what your health outcomes are. And we strongly believe that your zip code shouldn't be a determinant of your health, your children's health, your grandchildren's health. And that's what we're dealing with here. And so just a little bit more on this with Magnolia Park being one of the neighborhoods that we highlighted before. As you can see, it ranks in the 98th percentile for air toxic risk. It ranks in the upper 90s for air toxic cancer risk. These are communities that are disproportionately impacted. And we see this, unfortunately, every day. Earlier today, I spent a good portion of my morning actually in the hospital because one of our community members is in the hospital. He is part of one of the civic associations that we work with. He's had 2 strokes. He has had respiratory illness. This is also personal for me because this past November, I lost my mom to COPD. She had never smoked in her life, ever. She immigrated from India in the 1970s and she did not have asthma. And she came straight to Houston and she developed asthma. And unfortunately, that then developed into COPD. So she needed the use of oxygen 24/7 and slowly declined. And last winter, unfortunately, we lost her. And just personally, that has always been a motivator and a driver for the work that I do, because my mom's story, while personal to me, is unfortunately not isolated to me. My story is very common for people in my community and for the folks in Houston along the Houston Ship Channel and for the folks on the Gulf Coast and for the folks in the global South. And so, again, just the kind of exposures that we have, whether it's inhalation or skin contact, we have pipeline fires quite a bit. We had an energy transfer pipeline fire that burned for several days just this past winter as well, this past fall, I should say. And so the impacts of what that looks like, and oftentimes what actually gets released. You can see, for example, that Shell chemical fire with the school bus driving in front of it. What we found was getting released, or the regulated chemicals on site at that facility were things like ethylene and xylene and 1,3-butadiene, highly toxic chemicals that children and the elderly and regular everyday folks that are going to the grocery store are getting exposed to. And so this causes quite a bit of problems because there's a lack of transparency. A facility explodes, a petrochemical facility explodes. What's in the air? There's no easy way to find that information. But this is compounded by the fact that many in our community, whether they're undocumented or whether they're low resource, also a lot of times are linguistically isolated. So we have about 40% of the homes here in Houston speak Spanish. Out of that, nearly 1 million in Houston alone are what are considered limited English proficient, LEP. And so what that means is that English is not their primary language. And in times of disaster, that information is not making it out to those communities. And those communities are the ones that are disproportionately more likely to be on the fence line of these facilities. So one of the huge pieces of work that Fenceline Watch was able to accomplish when we were first starting was pushing for what's called language justice, meaning the equitable ability to participate in the public input process. So if Shell or Exxon or Valero or anybody wants to come into your community and seek a permit to expand a facility or to build a new facility, you have to provide translation, you have to provide interpretation. But language justice goes beyond just language that isn't English. It's also a layperson, a regular person, someone like you, someone like me can understand it. I am not a scientist. I am not an engineer. And so a lot of times these permits will use highly technical language, and we push for a plain language summary. So you can actually see the template here where they have to explain what they're doing, who's the owner of it. We push to have what chemicals they hope to produce and the health impacts. The state of Texas did not feel like that was necessary or relevant information for the communities that are going to be living next to these facilities. We strongly disagree, so there's still more work to be done. But we were able to successfully get a plain language summary. And this is just kind of a slice of the difficulty of getting transparency on these highly toxic chemicals into the hands of everyday folks. So, all of that to say that we have a problem where we're overproducing plastic. 98% of plastic comes from fossil fuels. It's sourced from fossil fuels. 90% of the outputs of petrochemicals made from these fossil fuels are going to plastic. 16,000 chemicals that we have no information on the health impacts of. We have communities that are facing explosions and leaks and toxic trespass from plumes that just hang over their communities. And then we have the greater impacts that we're seeing societally, whether it is the microplastics that are present in our blood, or the impaired, hampered air quality, or the leaching that occurs when plastic heats up. All of these things, it requires a strong, cohesive plan of attack. It requires global community coming together to tackle this immense problem that's impacting every sector of our economy, every portion of our society, and every part of our world. And so in 2022, the United Nations Environmental Assembly adopted Resolution 514. What this resolution mandated was a treaty to end plastic pollution through the development of what's called an international legally binding instrument, basically a treaty. So the process started in earnest in 2022, and 5 rounds of negotiations have occurred. Fenceline Watch is a United Nations civil society organization, so we've been able to participate in the negotiations, starting in 2022 in Uruguay, through Paris, in Nairobi, Canada, and most recently this past November in Korea, Busan, Korea. We were supposed to have a treaty by the end of 2024. It was supposed to be a 2-year process. When everyone met in November in Korea, we were supposed to come to an agreement on a treaty to tackle this problem. Unfortunately, that did not happen. So later this year, INC 5, which stands for the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, is going to be meeting again. The exact time hasn't been announced, where it hasn't been announced. But what we're looking for is an actual solution to this problem, not just a global treaty that talks about discarded plastic bottles or pushes for more recycling, but actually tackles the problem starting from extraction. We cannot stop the overproduction of plastic and the dire health impacts that our community and communities all over are facing until we actually start at the beginning. That's extraction, and that's production. The petrochemicals that go into plastic must be regulated under any treaty that's attempting to get a grip on the plastic crisis. They're not separated and they cannot be delinked. We need reductions in the amount of petrochemicals that are being produced in order to actually get a hold and start to turn the tide on this crisis. So I'm going to preface this by saying that the problems in the domestic stance, unfortunately, have probably gotten worse. There's been nothing official stated from the new administration in regards to the Global Plastics Treaty, whether they would be participating or not. To be frank, our view is that they most likely will not be picking up the previous administration stances. I say this as diplomatically as possible. And there are some that feel that the best thing that could happen is the United States simply pull out of it. That way, those countries that are interested in tackling this problem can do so and let global regulations start to take hold without the United States playing spoiler. There's another side to that, though, too. But on the domestic side, there's a lack of transparency. Where the U.S. position is now under this new administration is unknown, but we do believe it is obviously going to be a regression. We're also afraid of the funding of false solutions. So in July of last year, EPA released their draft national strategy to prevent plastic pollution. And basically everything that I outlined in terms of extraction and petrochemical production being the true keys to actually tackling the plastic pollution crisis are absent. It talks about waste management, and it pushes for things like chemical or advanced recycling, essentially pyrolysis, where you take a plastic bottle, you superheat it, what industry claims reduce it back down to a molecular level to create new plastic. Unfortunately, this technology has never been proven to actually be real. And the fundamental problem is all the toxics that go into the original production of plastic are once again released when you do something like chemical or advanced recycling. We're also seeing for the push of other greenwash solutions, such as hydrogen. There's a hydrogen hub that's slated for the Houston Ship Channel. And this would create things like the plastic to hydrogen pipeline. These are unproven technologies, and unfortunately also you're increasing pipeline infrastructure, you're increasing the risk of explosions and fires, and you're essentially creating more toxic chemicals. It's akin to taking poison out of a dirty glass and getting a shiny crystal glass and pouring it in there and saying you can drink it out of a cleaner glass. There is no safe way to continue to produce these petrochemicals, even if you decarbonize the process. And the United States position under the former administration and almost certainly under this new administration is that they would rather have national action, domestically guided action, rather than strong global guardrails. The US has advocated for that, and it would prefer that rather than being held to any kind of global compact or treaty. It wants to be it wants to determine how it's going to handle this crisis. But unfortunately, as we know, we live in a globalized world, and the plastic problem is not siloed solely to the United States. The petrochemicals that are produced in my community generally get shipped off either to Southeast Asia or to places like Antwerp in Belgium, where we have a sister port. And so there's no way to decouple these things. You can't just say, well, the US is going to handle it this way and another country is going to handle it that way. And we also see that there is a desire actually on the side of consumer brands, the Procter & Gamble's and the Nestle's, to have some kind of consistency. Consistency and stability are good for business for them. And if you have a patchwork of different regulations around plastics, around petrochemical production, it makes doing international business incredibly difficult. So then that takes us to actually problems that we see in the global space around negotiations for the treaty itself. So there's a conflict of interest, unfortunately. You have what are known as high ambition countries, HAC countries. This is led by many European countries that want to actually address the petrochemical side of things, whereas countries such as Japan, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, petchem states, are much less inclined to talk about the petrochemical side. You have countries and small island developing nations and nations within Africa that do want to tackle this problem. But there is an issue with the conflict of interest in terms of where the science is coming from and who has access to these spaces and who is actually able to get to speak to these delegations and decision makers. And there is a lack of access in terms of frontline and fence line and indigenous interventions. The photo at the bottom actually is Eva Ariano, Fenceline Watch's executive director, making an intervention at the negotiations. That's far and few for most civil society organizations, unfortunately. And then there are false equivalencies within the treaty process as a whole. So what we see oftentimes is scientists aren't given quite the same access as industry lobbyists are, but also they are making these negotiations much more available for groups such as ours, civil society observers and civil society members, but simply to observe. it's not actually an inclusive process in which we are able to advocate on behalf of our communities. And so the fear is that we're going to get a treaty that only touches half of the problem. And if you do half of the problem, you're not really doing much of anything. So what do we need? What are we pushing for? We're pushing for production reductions. We're pushing for legally binding targets around phase down of primary polymer production. This is the area that we need to tackle to actually stop the overproduction of these plastics. We need an elimination of chemicals hazardous to human health. We need a phase down of chemicals and groups of chemicals hazardous to health and environment. And we also push for a no data, no market approach. If you don't have data on a chemical, if we don't know what the impact is on human health of a certain chemical, it should have no market. It should not be able to be used in something that will be used in human consumption or that will be found in your kitchen or your medicine cabinet. If a stranger hands you a glass of an unknown substance and says, you can drink it, and you ask, what's in it? And they don't tell you, and you say, well, what it'll do to me? And they'll be like, I don't know. You'd probably be a little bit reticent to take a sip. And yet all around us are materials, plastic materials made up of these chemicals where that's exactly the case. We also need transparency for a full life cycle of plastic, chemical transparency. So finding out what chemicals are in the plastics that are in our life. And we need harmonized reporting on the full life cycle of plastic, from the extraction point until it's time to have it discarded or some kind of waste management, because right now there is no data on that. So we have these substances, we have these plastics made of substances that we don't know the impacts on. We don't know the entire life cycle of this plastic production and what it's doing, not just to our health, but also to the environment. And so that's what we need. We need production reduction. We need the elimination of these chemicals that are hazardous to human health. And we need transparency for the full life cycle of all the environmental and human health impacts. Again, production caps, polymers, chemicals of concern. We need an elimination of corporate corruption that we find in this process and domestically. And just as a little action item, I know a lot of times we can get on these webinars and you can hear a bunch of this stuff and then you're like, okay, well, I don't know what to do. Small little thing. Here's another QR code. It's not to a map. This one is actually to a letter put together by the PPC, the Peak Plastic Coalition, to the United States government to take a stronger stance on the Global Plastics Treaty and the U.S. position. Again, it's a new administration. We don't know where they stand, but we have a pretty good idea. That being said, just as Dana said in the beginning, as annoying as it may seem, we have to have our voice heard. The other side always is, and we need to make sure that we are providing a counterbalance to that. And I just like to thank, again, the Missouri River Bird Observatory and all of you for letting me share a little bit about my community and the impacts of petrochemicals on us. And I'd also like to take this briefly, this moment, to say that a lot of the information and data that you just saw, from that interactive map that we put together to the figures and the facts that were shown, that's from tools that are no longer publicly available thanks to the new administration. We use tools such as EJ Screen and the Toxic Release Inventory Tracker to get volumes of chemicals that are regulated on site, to get information about compliance history for these facilities. A lot of the graphs and data that were in this presentation were on tools that have now been taken down. And what we're seeing, unfortunately, at EPA is the forced removal or the forced leave of many in the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights, the office that was charged with making sure that those communities that are facing disproportionate burdens and impacts are being heard. It was an office of about 160. All of them have been on forced leave. And so that lack of transparency, unfortunately, is widening. And it is having a tangible impact on organizations such as ours, and I'm sure many of you, and the ability to do advocacy and get simple information for our communities. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll hand it back to Dana. I think we might be doing a Q&A if I understand correctly.
You do understand correctly, Shiv. Thank you very much. The removal of so much information alongside of the removal of so many staff members is really, really concerning. Like that's basically censorship of information, and it's not just happening at EPA, right? Um, On to questions. So I don't know how easily you can pull up the Q&A. Our first question, Shiv, is with such a high amount of toxins in the air, do you use an air purifier? And I will say that there's a number of different questions, basically being like, how do you and the folks that you work with like deal with being in this situation all the time?
Yeah. So I'm wiping my nose right now. Apologies, because I have been sick. I know a lot of folks have been. So we have an air purifier at the office. Unfortunately, I don't know what the specific brand is, but we have personal protective gear when we go out. At Fenceline Watch, when an explosion happens or something, we run to the fire. In the presentation or our socials, you can go and see our blue sky, our Twitter, unfortunately. And you can see some of the videos when we're out there. And so sometimes it's as simple as an N95 face mask. Unfortunately, sometimes these things happen and we don't have any protective gear and we're out there. But a lot of times, unfortunately, we have to kind of sit either in our homes or in our office, shut off the AC if there's a specifically bad kind of flare or explosion or leak, and just wait. There isn't really a silver bullet that we have in terms of kind of like personal protection to protect ourselves. But again, if you smell like rotten eggs in the air or if your eyes start to burn, quickest thing to do is try to find somewhere inside and protect yourself as much as possible. So I see another question here. How can we have an impact when our president has withdrawn us from the International Climate Accord and installed Zeldin as head of EPA? Which, as an aside, Lee Zeldin, I continue to mispronounce as Led Zeppelin, which at least gives me a little bit of something to smile about right now. So this is actually interesting simply because, as I stated before, there might be value in the U.S. not necessarily being in these negotiations if it means that they're not playing spoiler. We don't know if that's going to be the case or not, unfortunately. There is a very good chance that we stay in the negotiations, and just as we've seen the administration do with other things such as the war in Ukraine, just take a drastically different position than the former administration. And that would embolden those like Saudi Arabia and Japan and other low ambition countries to have a weakened treaty or even try to elongate the process even more. That being said, if a global treaty is achieved, which is very possible, that actually has some teeth, you've then kind of created a global marketplace where if you're not party to this treaty, it makes trade that much more difficult. Also, there's something to be said about the creation of global guardrails. So we're in Texas. Everything that's happening at the federal level, frankly, it sucks, but it's not very different from how we deal with life here. Texas's government is not terribly different than what the federal government looks like. But when we had a more friendly administration at the top, those federal regulations provided protective standards for us, even when the state of Texas did not. In this instance, it just zooms out a little bit more. If there are adopted global guardrails for the production of petrochemicals, those will provide some standard of protection, even if our federal government is not interested in it. The vast majority of petrochemical companies along the Houston Ship Channel and in the United States are not domestic companies. They're international companies. So if the cost of doing business in the EU and in Africa and Asia have to hew to the Global Plastics Treaty, then they'll have to do that here to be able to sell anywhere else. And so that's one way in which, even if we are absent from this process, we can still get some benefit out of it in the United States and as a whole in terms of tackling plastic. How will you get industry that is producing the plastic to respect the treaty? So that one is interesting because industry is very much part of this treaty process. They are not aside from it, and it's not something that they're not also trying to shape, for good and for bad. Good in the sense that if they know it's coming down the pipeline or that there is the potential for regulation, they're going to try to come to the table. Negotiations, a lot of times you don't get everything you want, but you try to establish something that's not there. So things like chemical transparency, or even getting certain chemicals blacklisted, or getting agreements for phase down. It might not be all of the toxic chemicals that we want to address. It might not be all of the reductions that we want, but it would be a process that could start. And a good treaty provides the opportunity for strengthening down the line. And so this is one of those situations where, very simply, companies want stability. They want consistency. They want to be able to know, what is this marketplace going to look like? And the treaty actually does provide an alternative to a bunch of different domestic policies all over the globe in which they're trying to navigate and negotiate, which is currently what's happening now. Let's see.
Hey, Shiv. So Scott had what he asked earlier was, can you put the QR code up again? And I tried putting the bit.ly link in the Q&A and
Yeah.
it did not work. So could you possibly, the link to the map?
It worked
Yeah.
for me. I don't know.
Yeah, let me go ahead and do that again right now. Let me find it. Do
Thanks. I think people were definitely interested in the interactive map. So
Oh yeah, no, and we definitely want folks to use it. It took some doing putting it together, and we're proud of it, and we hope folks can do it. I'm gonna go ahead and drop this in the chat right now, and if folks are having difficulty, just let me know, and I will definitely make sure that that does work. Okay, there we go. All right. Let's see. On the evening news, I heard that soda companies are increasing production of plastic bottles in response to the aluminum tariffs. Yes. Unfortunately, as we've seen, there has been a lot of backsliding, especially within the last about 6 months. Coca-Cola had a lot of ambitious efforts to reduce their plastic. They had ambitious climate goals that, because of the trajectory of the political climate, not just in the United States, but unfortunately globally, they're seeing an opening. That being said, one of the keys with this treaty is not just taking away the social license of using plastic. One of our hopes is that when we look back at the amount of plastic and the proliferation of plastic, it's almost like when you watch like an episode of Mad Men, or you think about the 1950s and people smoking in an airplane. You can't fathom it. Drinking out of a plastic water bottle is tantamount to that, just because we know that the health impacts are there. That's been established. So even if companies are backsliding in the near term, there's no denying the data. There's no denying the science. The science shows that this is comprised of extremely toxic chemicals that have short-term and long-term health impacts. And that's not good for business regardless. So we do hold out hope that eventually it just becomes an avalanche. We had climate deniers, and we still have quite a few when it comes to climate change. But unfortunately, we're seeing the droughts, and we're seeing the floods, and we're seeing the fires, and it becomes harder and harder. Unfortunately, we're seeing the higher and increased rates of developmental delays, cancers, respiratory risks. In terms of a specific ask to Senators Hawley and Schmidt, it's one of those things where it's pushing that you are aware that there is a global plastics treaty. In my line of work, I have really dear friends that do not know that there's a global plastics treaty. And to be frank, if I wasn't working in it, I wouldn't know. It doesn't get covered that much. And so to say that, hey, I'm concerned about the chemicals in plastic, I'm concerned about the amount of plastic there is, I know this treaty is going on, as someone who lives in the United States, I want to be at the table. I think that we need to have our voice heard. That would be the ask for it. And also, frankly, meeting the moment, telling them don't take away regular everyday folks' ability to access information. Regardless of where you stand on petrochemicals, oil and gas, or anything else, it's really, really hard to look a constituent in the eye, to look somebody in the face and say, you shouldn't be able to access information that impacts you. There's no good reason why it shouldn't be available. That's an answer. Is there a reason that they don't use more glass? We don't subsidize it. Plastic is heavily subsidized. There's an act that I mentioned earlier, the Toxic Substance Control Act. That means that certain chemicals have to get prioritized and regulated. There's a specific exemption for polymers. It's called a polymer exemption. It's meant to actually increase the amount of domestic production of polymers for plastic. Plastic is cheap. Companies use what's cheap. It's cheap because the costs of plastic are externalized on our communities. If you look at the actual cost of plastic in terms of healthcare, in terms of lost days at work, in terms of the chemical disasters that occur, like the train derailment that happened in Ohio, or the number of explosions that we had here in the Houston Ship Channel, all of these things are costs that go to plastic that are not actually considered. And so just like we have corn subsidies, we have plastic subsidies. And so we don't do that for glass. We don't do that for other alternatives. And that's something that does need to change. Okay, let's see. If the rest of the world came to an agreement to decrease plastic production, will that have any effect on the production of chemicals on our end, especially since most of those chemicals are byproducts of petrochemical fractionation? Can we hope there will be a decrease in demand? So the petrochemical market is actually interesting right now because it's going through a period of a bit of constriction. During the pandemic, there was overproduction. And so right now, there's more petrochemicals sitting in storage than actual use. We're also seeing that in China, that petrochemical production has not abated and it's continuing. That's depressing the price of petrochemicals. And so what's occurring now is industry finding new novel ways to use that petrochemicals. Petrochemicals became an issue because things started to electrify and we were still pulling it out of the ground. We were still fracking gas and pulling up oil and gas. And so they're like, what do we do with it? Let's make chemicals. What are we going to do with all these chemicals? Let's make everything out of plastic. I'm old enough to remember when Gatorade bottles were glass. There was no reason to change to plastic, but the chemicals were there, subsidized, cheaper for business. So that's kind of one of those situations where if their production caps, it can bring the market more back in line. But the market isn't going to save us here because, unfortunately, petrochemicals are still getting produced even though there is just a lot of it and there are no off-takers at the moment. One of the scientists who was interviewed on the People's Pharmacy recently reported that every U.S. citizen ingests a credit card worth of plastic each week. It contributes to the development of dementia. That is correct. That is one of the most famous and a lot of times one of the most powerful, impactful pieces of information that we have given to folks. Actually, a study came out in 2024, I believe, potentially from CL or Gaia. Don't quote me on that, but it's a study in which microplastics and plastics were found in the placenta of expectant mothers, and also in rain clouds, as I mentioned. Plastic is everywhere, places it should not be. And unfortunately, we know it shouldn't be there, and we don't fully appreciate or understand all the impacts that it actually is going to have on our bodies, like dementia. And so fully understanding that the impacts from the moment we start to extract it from the ground to the toxics that go into the air for the production of the chemicals to plastic, to the leaching occurring when it finds its way into our waterways and then into our bloodstreams, there is no point where there is not some kind of toxic impact from plastic. And unfortunately, as time moves forward, we'll start to fully understand everything that we've been exposed to and hopefully get us into a place where we can protect future generations so they don't have to.
Wow, that was It was great. It looks like we covered quite a few of the questions there. There's more questions in the Q&A. We didn't have to scurry through the chat too much to find them, so that was really nice. We really appreciate how you were able to bring this to our attention. I think everybody wants to do something about it, and what you've just done here is help spread knowledge about it. And I think the more others keep spreading the knowledge about it, will really help others learn about it. I think it's a big part of the puzzle. Often we just think, do I need to knock down these doors? Yes. Yes. Do I need to knock on these doors and call these people? Yes. But keep talking to people. We have a lot of strength locally, and there's a lot we can do locally as well.
Yeah, and the questions were great. And again, I really want to thank you both and the Missouri River Bird Observatory for the opportunity. Again, I'll be honest, I've never really spoken to a bird observatory group before, and I think that's so awesome. I know you guys are so much more than that, and everybody on the call as well for making the time to come out to this, because sometimes it's easy to see these things as just kind of like disparate issues, but they impact everything. We see how migratory patterns are being impacted by climate change, and we see how petrochemicals are impacting what's happening in our climate, and all of these things are interlinked. And so it's very important in all of these spaces that we find those points of convergence, and we can link and be stronger even in the face of really difficult times. So I really, really want to thank you guys for joining, and also for you guys giving me the opportunity to kind of share about my community and what's going on here in Houston and also globally.
And with that, thank you so much, Shiv. Seriously, really appreciate you. And we'll talk to everyone later.
Have a good night, everyone.